In this week's beginner-friendly watercolor tutorial, we're practicing essential skills such as color mixing and water control, as well as foundational techniques such as wet on wet, wet on dry, layering for depth. Not to mention, we're also practicing our freehand sketching, and I'm sharing some of my best tips to help you arrive at believable shapes and proportions, as well as how to utilize your drawing space effectively so that you can arrive at better outcomes. For those of you who would like to skip over the freehand sketching process and jump straight into the painting, I'll be linking to a free and public post over on my Patreon. If you scroll to the end of the post, you'll find the downloadables that I created to go along with this tutorial, which include my outline sketch and the reference photo. I've included the link to that post right under this video in the description box. With all that said, let's jump in. All right, first things first, we need to create our pencil sketch. I'm using an HB pencil, and I always make sure to start my drawing nice and light so that I can easily erase mistakes and make any needed refinements as I go. When I'm first getting started with my sketch, what I'm focusing on are proportions and utilizing my drawing space effectively. In this specific case, we have two separate elements or groupings of elements because we have one smaller papaya piece and we have a larger half papaya. And so I see these as two separate groups. And I want to make sure that both of these groups, or the shapes that these groups create, fit in my drawing space effectively. I don't want to leave too much negative space around them to the point that they are very small. I want these to be a good size, but I also want to make sure that they fit within my drawing space. I'm constantly using little tick marks that I lay down before actually committing and drawing the full shape so that I can visualize the size of these elements and their location within space. And you can see how I'm using oversimplified blocky shapes that I create by bringing together a series of straight lines. Not really concerning myself with creating perfect shapes with smooth curves and tuning out those smaller details in this part of the process, because at first I'm focusing on proportions and then on creating a sense of structure. Then come those final smaller details, always making my way from large to small, general towards specific. After creating those largest shapes, I started creating the sensation of three-dimensional structure by adding in the different planes that I'm able to see in these papaya pieces. From this vantage point that we're seeing these pieces of fruit from, we can see that both of these have at least one flat section to them that counts as one plane. And then for each of these, we also see outer sections of the papaya, the outer skin. And that, of course, is a curve. And there are multiple planes in curved structures. However, by at least separating out the flat plane from the outer planes, that already creates the sense of three-dimensional structure. And very importantly for this particular type of fruit, we have this hollow section in the middle. With the smaller piece, it's just like a curve that I cut out or erased out, and then I added in the seeds inside. And then for the larger piece, that large shape that I created in the middle is going to be that hollow area. And because it's mostly covered with seeds, I don't concern myself too much with separating out plane changes inside of that inward kind of concave curve there. After doing that, I added in the sense of those seeds. Now, when it comes to something as small as these seeds, where we have so many of them, I never tried to copy the reference photo exactly as is. I just use the major characteristics for these seeds, meaning their size in relation to the papaya as a whole, their shape, how they are overlapping, the approximate amount of these seeds, their location. That kind of thing is important, but I'm adding these in quickly and quite loosely. And I finish up my sketch by adding in a cast shadow under these elements. Adding in a sense of shadow under your elements is always going to create a more finalized look to the piece. and it'll also help enhance that sense of mass and structure to these elements. Okay, and with that done, let's get into the watercolor painting process. For this piece, I only brought in 5 different colors. And the first thing that I do is I use my size 14 round brush to prepare the color mixtures that I'm going to be using for the first phase of this process. I want to have these on my palette ready to go so that I'm not choosing random colors as I go and so that I can paint nice and quick. The first puddle on my palette is a mixture of permanent lemon yellow and yellow ochre. This is the color that I created for the outer skin of the papaya pieces. I observed that reference photo and created a color that is similar to what I am seeing there. You can see that as the base color for the outer skin. And we will be dropping in a little bit of green and also creating a darker version of the same color to darken shadow areas. But see that as the base color for the outer skin. I tested that color mixture out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper to ensure that it is similar to what I'm observing there. The second puddle that I create is an orange looking color which was created by mixing together permanent lemon yellow and permanent red light. I added in enough of each color until I arrived at an orange, and this is for the edible flesh of the fruit. I also prepared a little puddle of plain olive green on my palette, and I just wanted to have that green ready to go so that I can pop some of that in and create little green speckles on that outer skin of the papaya, while that initial yellowish color for the outer skin is still wet. This way I can pop in that green with a small brush and create small soft blooms. With my initial color mixtures ready to go, I change my water because I'm going to be using the pre-wetting technique. Then, using my size 14 round brush, I take a little bit of water from my container at a time and gently smooth it on all over this larger papaya piece. I pre-wet both the flat upper plane and the outer skin or exterior planes of this papaya piece, and the inner hollow portion as well. Make sure that you go over the entire thing several times gently until you see a nice even sheen. Don't start painting in your color until you see that even sheen. Otherwise, things are going to start drying on you way too quickly, and you're not going to be able to arrive at these soft wet on wet effects, and you're not going to have enough time to develop a nice range of both hue and value in this first layer. Once I see that nice even sheen all throughout this first papaya piece, I get started with the golden yellowish color that I created for the exterior skin of the papaya. I paint in that color in this area, and if some of it bleeds into the orangish flesh section, I just leave it be. Then I remove that yellow from my paintbrush bristles, and I start painting in that orange color in the edible flesh section. You can see how I'm painting over the seeds. It's perfectly fine to paint over the seeds because they are black, and so because black is such a dark color, or the darkest color that there is, it's going to cover up that lighter orangish color underneath with no issue at all. But you can see how throughout this entire orange portion of the papaya, I left some lighter areas with little to no pigment in them, and I created some darker areas by layering on more color or using this orange in a slightly thicker state. I would recommend leaving more of that paper shining through in the seed area if you want that bright white paper to stand in place for your highlights in your seeds, and you don't want to have to bring in so much white gouache at the end. But in general, I wanted to make sure to have some darker orange areas and some lighter orange areas. I avoided over blending because that will just flatten everything out and get rid of that watercolor glow. At this point, everything is still wet and workable because I took my time with the pre-wetting process. So I take advantage of the fact that I can still do a little bit more value development, and I add more yellow ochre into my yellow color mixture on my palette to darken it a little bit more, and I layer on this color in shadow areas in the exterior skin section. You can see how I'm only layering this color on in shadow areas that I want to darken more, and I'm leaving the first yellow layer shining through in lighter value areas. Then I quickly add in more lemon yellow into this mixture to lighten it back up again so that I can paint in that opposite edge of the skin. And I make sure to paint that in with just the tip of my brush because it's a very narrow sliver that I am painting in. Once that's done, I add in a little bit of Payne's Gray into my yellow ochre and lemon yellow color mixture to darken it, and I drop that into darker shadow areas in the exterior skin to push shadows even more. Then I quickly switch on over to my size 3 round brush because it's finally time to add in some green blooms in the outer skin before it dries. And I just add in those little specks in a very irregular way, making sure not to go overboard with the amount. I check on my paper quickly and everything still seems wet and workable, so I switch on back to my size 14 round brush and drop in a little bit more of my orange color mixture into certain areas in the edible flesh section so that I can develop some darker values, increase that tonal range so that things look a little bit more realistic. Watercolor is always going to dry lighter than it looks when it was freshly placed on paper, so things are getting a little bit lighter. And for believable results, it is important that all throughout these elements we have a nice range of values from lighter areas to midtones to darkest darks. And here you're going to see me do a little bit of lifting with a clean and slightly damp brush. You can always use the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush to remove some of that color if you think things are getting a little bit too dark. I allow everything to dry completely for around 15 to 20 minutes. And once everything is dry, it's time to do the same thing in the smaller papaya piece. So I first start by creating my color mixtures that I'm going to be needing for this first part of the process, which is my yellow ochre plus lemon yellow mixture, my orange mixture, which is a mixture of permanent red light and my lemon yellow, and a little bit of sap green. With those ready on my palette, I change my water and I start doing my pre-wetting using my size 14 round brush, bringing a little bit of water at a time from my container and smoothing it on gently, going over the entire thing several times so that everything can stay wet for a little bit longer. As I am doing my pre-wetting, I do leave the upper section of those seeds free of water. And this is because the edible orange flesh section doesn't actually go up to that area. That is all seeds in this case. And if I pre-wet all the way to the upper edge of those seeds, I risk the orange expanding all the way up to that edge. Once I see that nice even sheen, it is time to start painting in my color, starting with the yellow color that I created for the outer skin. Once I painted that in, I remove that yellow from my paintbrush bristles and I start painting in my orange for the edible flesh section. You can see how I'm arriving at soft, wet on wet effects because everything is still wet, and I continue developing a range of orange values by layering on more of my orange here and there while leaving other sections lighter with more of that bright paper shining through. Once those larger shapes are painted in, I do switch on over to my size 8 round brush for this one because these are smaller shapes and I do want a little bit more control. Hopefully you can see how I am holding myself back from doing any over blending and also layering on too much color when it's not really necessary. This will help me arrive at fresh, easy results that are not overworked. Once I painted in that orange section, I added in a little bit more yellow ochre into my yellow color mixture to create some slightly darker sections in the outer skin. And then I added in a tiny bit of Payne's Gray into my yellow mixture to darken sections even more. Once I was happy with that nice range of values in the exterior skin portion, I quickly switched on over to my size 3 round brush to pop in some green blooms to create that speckled look. And then it was time to allow that papaya piece to dry. Once everything was dry, it was time to start working on the seeds. For the seeds, I have both my size 3 and my size 0 round brushes on hand. I prepare a puddle of plain Payne's Gray on my my palette. And I would say that this is a coffee to milk consistency. And I start going in with my size 3 round brush using a C-stroke motion, sometimes curving toward the left, other times curving toward the right. And I'm using C-strokes so that I can leave little highlight sections in the center of at least many of these seeds. Not every single seed needs to have a highlight, but I try to get a highlight in most at this point. And I just continue filling in this area, making sure that I'm overlapping these circular looking shapes over each other here and there, clustering them together in different ways, continuing to use those C strokes as much as possible, and sometimes filling in the entire circle, sometimes not. Every now and then I'm adding more Payne's gray into this puddle to thicken it up and create darker seeds, but you can see how overall there is a variety in value or tone in my blacks and grays as I'm painting in these seeds. That variety is important. You want some of your seeds to look lighter, other seeds to look darker. If all of your seeds are a flat, super dark black, that's not going to look very natural or very realistic. So I load up my paintbrush bristles and I start going in, and naturally, as that paint starts running out from your bristles, you're going to start painting a lighter gray. Just let that happen. And once you notice that you're not really painting in that much color, or you need more paint/water because you're doing too much dry brushing, you can go ahead and take more paint. As that watercolor starts to dry, of course, the blacks and grays are going to look even lighter, and you can feel free to do more layering over those areas, sometimes overlapping other shapes over shapes that you've already created, and other times perhaps choosing to darken shapes that you've already created. It all depends on how things are looking. I also switch on over to my size 0 round brush to darken little areas in seeds that I've already painted in, or even adding in extra shapes behind seeds. Once I feel I have a good amount of seeds, I leave that for now and I do a little bit more work in the orange flesh sections. I need to define the edge between the upper flat plane of the papaya and where the planes start to shift and become an inwards kind of curve, concave section. And to do that, I use my size 3 round brush and the same orange color mixture that I was using before for this area. And you can see how I'm painting in these long kind of abstract shapes that look a little bit thinner in certain areas and a little bit thicker in others. And the secret to getting that variation in thickness in your shapes is to simply vary the pressure that you're exerting on your paintbrush as you're painting in that shape. Sometimes you press down a little bit more, sometimes you lift and only the tip of your brush comes into contact with your paper as you're painting in that shape. If you want to soften the outer edges, you can definitely go in with a clean and slightly damp brush and run your paintbrush bristles over that edge. Another thing that I do is darken around the seeds so that I can create more of an inwards sensation and a bit of a shadow effect behind or under the seeds. I try not to reach all the way to the long edge shapes that I had painted in before. In some cases I do, but I try to leave some lighter areas in between these new shadow shapes and the previous kind of definition that I created between the flat plane and the inwards plane. I first go in and paint some orange shapes behind the seeds with my orange color mixture. And once I painted in those shapes, I add in a little bit of Payne's gray into the orange to darken it a bit. And I drop in some of this darker orange in little areas that I want to push even more. I also take a moment to add more definition along the outer skin of the papaya. For this, I continue using my size 3 round brush and I go back to the base color mixture that I was using for the outer skin, which was my lemon yellow plus yellow ochre color combo. And I do make sure to add in more yellow ochre this time so that that color can look a little bit darker. My brush strokes are very similar to what I did when I was creating that definition between the upper plane and the inward curve in the edible part of the papaya, where I create an abstract long shape and press down and lift my paintbrush as I am painting that in to create thicker sections and thinner sections, and sometimes those shapes don't even meet. This helps me avoid the look of thick outlines, which are not very realistic. And then I do a little bit more work in the seeds using my size 0 round brush and my Payne's gray, just darkening little sections here and there. But you can see how throughout my seeds I have highlights, I have lighter grays, and I have almost black looking areas. That's exactly what I want. And then it is time to do the same work in the other papaya piece. Using my size 3 round brush and my plain Payne's gray, I continue using those C strokes, sometimes curving toward one direction, sometimes curving toward the other, making sure that I am leaving little sections of white paper unpainted so that they can look like highlights in these seeds. I continue doing the same thing over and over again, making sure that I'm overlapping these shapes in different ways, making sure that there's a lot of variety in how I am clustering these together, and also variety in terms of value or tone in my grays. I want some of these to look lighter and others to look darker. And because I am painting these on dry paper, things are drying pretty quickly and my color is starting to lighten as it dries. As I see things lightening up and drying, I do more overlapping in certain areas that I want to darken more. Here I switched to my size 0 round brush, and I'm just using the smaller brush to darken smaller areas in between the seeds and also inside of certain seeds. And then it was time to add some definition with my orange. So going back to my size 3 round brush and my orange color mixture that I was using for the edible flesh sections of this fruit, adding in a little bit of definition in those edges where there is a plane change. If I want to soften any edges, I go in with a clean and slightly damp brush. And I also add a little bit of definition along the edge of the outer skin where the yellowish greenish portion meets the orange portion. For that, I went back to the base color that I was using for the outer skin, which was that yellow ochre plus lemon yellow color combo. And then it was time to come back to see the piece as a whole and do more work in both papaya pieces. I got started by darkening some darkest shadow sections in the outer skin of both papaya pieces. And for that, I went back to my yellow ochre and lemon yellow color mixture, but I did add in a little bit of Payne's gray to darken that color even more for these darker shadow areas. What's cool about using Payne's gray to darken this base color, if you will, is that Payne's gray has blue in it. It's a cool gray that is blue biased. And so blue plus yellow equals green. And there is definitely a greenish hue to the skin of the papaya. After developing those darker shadow areas in the outer skin, I go back to my orange color mixture to darken certain areas in the edible portion of the papaya, wet on dry now. And I just loosely go in to paint some orange shapes and sections that I want to darken. This increases that tonal range in the orange parts of the papaya, making things look a little bit more realistic. After doing that, I switch on over to my size 8 round brush and go back to my Payne's gray. I make sure to use it in more of a coffee or tea consistency, pretty watered down, and in a very loose way, making sure that I'm not painting a very blocky, defined shape or anything like that. I go in and do overlapping with this Payne's gray in the middle of that seed area in the larger papaya piece, and also here and there where there is a lot of overlapping taking place in the smaller papaya piece. This way, I can create that sense of that middle section being more sunken in. Enhance that illusion of certain seeds being closer to the light source and others being further back. All right, a couple more things that I'm gonna do before calling this still life study done. The first thing is adding in some cast shadow shapes. And for my cast shadows, I decide to repeat colors that I've already used in the piece because I know that this is going to lead to more color harmony and integrated results. And I could have just used Payne's Gray to paint in my shadows, but what I decide to do is mix together the red that I've already been using, which is permanent red light, and olive green. Because red and green are complementary colors, meaning opposites in the color wheel, I know that if I mix enough of these colors together, I'm gonna get a brownish hue or a grayish hue that can work great for a dark cast shadow shape. So I work on that mixture and I test it out. And once I had that dark color mixture on my palette, which in this case looks more like a dark brown when I mix this specific red with this specific green, I used my size 14 round brush to loosely paint in that shadow shape. And I did soften the lower edges, especially by going in with a clean and slightly damp brush while that paint was still wet. I did go in to do more overlapping with this dark brown in the occlusion shadow areas nearest the fruit. I find the shadow shapes will look more realistic if you do have the occlusion shadows, those darkest areas nearest the elements that are blocking that light and not allowing that light to hit the surface beneath them. And to finish up this piece, I decide to go in with some white gouache. I don't really like using my watercolor brushes with my gouache whenever I do bring in gouache. I know that a lot of artists do, but the thing is that gouache is an opaque painting medium. And if I don't make sure to completely rinse out that gouache from my paintbrush bristles once I'm done with the gouache, I can definitely run the risk of making my vibrant watercolors muddy, opaque, and end up with a piece that has a certain chalkiness to it, and that's something that I want to avoid. So I'm using a cheaper multimedia size 0 round brush, and I'm just reinforcing highlights in some of my seeds so that they can really pop. Gouache is pretty thick straight out of the tube, and I do use a separate mixing palette, squeeze a little bit of that gouache there, add in a little bit of water, swivel that water into the gouache, and once I like the consistency, I go ahead and use it. If the consistency of your gouache is too watery, you're likely going to end up with semi-transparent, chalky looking shapes, and you want opaque highlights. So don't water down your gouache too much. Just add in a few drops of water until you notice that you have a consistency that you can work with. And then just add in some highlights here and there, making sure that you're coming back to see the piece as a whole. Less is more, there is no need to go overboard. I also brought in a little bit of white gouache, just very, very subtly created some highlights where I have those plane changes, where the flat plane turns into that inward section where the seeds are. All right, everyone, and with that, we're all done with the still life watercolor painting tutorial. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.